on this last time. Well, uh, as as was mentioned, my early life and difficult childhood, memories of the war and bombing, and nights in the air raid shelter, and then school and starting to ring. My early days of ringing and lots of early friendships with young people that I've maintained throughout my life, actually, in several instances, some of which I wish I'd maintained, that I'd love to find now, but I can't. My involvement in the early days with Walsall and the Black Country and so on. I didn't complete all of my discussions about the St. Martin's Band. And there were several two key people in particular that I forgot to talk about. And I do apologize for that because they are very important people. You remember I talked about the Baldies at St. Martin's, and I'll just recap on that. We had about 15 members on the scroof. The scroof, yes, that's an interesting term. I did try to remember what the scroof was, but in reality, we used to get paid. You know, we used to get paid on Sunday to ring on Sunday mornings, and the conductor of the band kept a record of who attended and who didn't attend, and on the Sunday before Christmas, everybody turned up. Everybody was about 15 of us actually, but everybody turned up, and the conductor would then tell you how often you'd attended during the year, and as a proportion of that, how much money you were going to get. And you got the princely sum of, well, as far as I was concerned, 2 pints of beer or something like that. It wasn't very much, but it was, we were actually paid, so we were professionals in those days. So of those on the scroof, 14 or 15 of us, 8 of them were completely bald. And it was a concern for some young people who'd got lots of hair, and one in particular who had lovely blonde hair. He'll remain nameless at the moment, but he was very concerned that he would catch this awful disease of going bald. And Charlie Webb and I used to giggle and laugh about this, you know, about his concern. Unfortunately, it turned out to be true. It was a disease, and Charlie caught it because he's as bald as a coot now. So that was the early time. Now, the people that I forgot were actually the most important people, like Albert Walker. Albert Walker was the conductor of the band, and he'd been running the band since the early part of the century, like at least 50 years. And Albert was perhaps one of the most famous ringers in the country at that time. He was a very good conductor of Stedman Sings and well noted for it. And he was actually a very nice guy. He was very impish and quick-witted, with shiny little black eyes, as I remember him. So he looked impish. He looked the part. And I remember once when we came down from St. Martin's in my very early days, when we came out of the door at St. Martin's, on the right hand, there was a churchyard then. It's all gone now, but there was a churchyard, and on the right hand side there was a bench, and there were lots of guys lying, sleeping, or whatever on this bench, drinking cider. Of course, that was the issue. And Albert said, "You see those guys over there? Yeah, yes, sir, yes. They're the St. Paul's ringers. They come up from London frequently to listen to some good ringing." Now that was funny enough in itself, but it seems that they were telling the same story down in London about the St Martin's ringer. So it's just one of those silly little stories that goes on. What else about Albert? He was a very good teacher, actually. I do recall after ringing at St Martin's, we would retire and have a cup of coffee in Woolworths or Joe Lyons, one or the other. And after that, we would retire to the Trocadero. The Trocadero is a pub in Birmingham for those. Lots of smiling faces all of a sudden when I mentioned the Trocadero. Good, happy memories, I guess. But in the Trocadero, we would there have a couple of pints, and occasionally, Albert would come into the Trocadero, and he would call me over. Young lad, 17 years old, something like that, and he would then say, "Do you know how to prick out Stedman?" And you know, it was always the same thing, because he used to forget what he'd done previously. He was 77 at least. When I first met him, he was 77, so he was no chicken. And he would then show me how to compose Stedman sinks, and he spent quite a lot of time doing that. And he loved teaching people things. So he was a lovely guy in many respects. Not a big man, height about 5'7", something like that, but reasonably well built. All of the ringing that he'd done made him well built. Yeah, he was a great guy. The other guy at St Martin's that I hadn't mentioned or hadn't talked about much was Frank Haynes. Frank Haynes was sort of Albert's deputy. I don't think there was such a thing as deputy, but he used to do quite a lot of the conducting. Now, when Haynes turned up in Birmingham, he was an educated man. He'd been to Cambridge. I don't think we had anybody in the band that had done anything like that. So he suddenly was very important, you know. Actually, there might have been someone else thinking about it. Padden Smith. I don't know whether he was a university man. I suspect not, but he was a pretty important man in Birmingham. Padden Smith had been a ringer at St Martin's. I never actually ran with him, but he'd been a ringer at St Martin's since almost the turn of the century, I suppose, for a very long time. And he was a very competent ringer, apparently. He had been Lord Mayor of Birmingham in 1950. That was obviously a very important post, and another little story. Here I go. This is where I get lost in my timescale. Another little story was that he actually was Alf Smith when he when he first started ringing, and his first few peals were recorded as Alf Smith. But when he became Alderman Padden Smith, he dropped the Alf bit and said, "My name is now Padden." So everybody had to call him Padden. But he was a nice guy. I went to several dinners where he spoke, and I met him a couple of times, but I never rang with him at all. So that was an aside. So here comes Haynes from Cambridge University, and you know, everybody, you know, the only educated guy in the band, and obviously he became a conductor as well, and he was a very skilled. His son Bill is a member of the band at the moment, which is very interesting and rewarding. I think, well, I know he was a teacher. Frank Haynes was a teacher, and I'm fairly confident it was at Handsworth Grammar School, but I couldn't be certain. You tend to forget these things when you get on a bit, you know. And George Fern, of course, was a big factotum in Birmingham in those days. He used to run everything. George was secretary of the guild. Whatever it was you wanted to do in Birmingham, you spoke to George, because he organised everything. He organised all the peals and all of the ringing and the dinner, and organised the speakers and everything. Everything went through George. So George was pretty important. I've forgotten where I was going now. Where was I going? Oh yeah, Frank Haynes. Yeah, George used to say about Frank. He'd say, I asked him if he'd come and ring an appeal, and do you know what he said? He said, "George, I'll come if it's wet." "What bloody good is that?" said George. And then there was another little aside. Frank and Sid Holloway used to go to the Conservative Club for drinking on Sundays, and George used to disparagingly call it "that club." Yes, so that was as much as I really want to say about St Martin's. I'm happy to answer any questions if anybody wants to know.
Yeah, before we move on, John, there is a question.
Okay, go for it.
I think it's been partially answered by a couple of people in the chat box, but whilst we've got you, Stella says, apologies if you told us last time, but when you started at St Martin's, were there any women, female ringers there, apart from the Baldies? And of course, last time you spoke about Muriel Rie, but were there any other women who rang at St Martin's sort of at this time?
No, quite. Oh, I seem to have lost you. Just a minute.
We haven't lost you.
Can you see me?
You can.
Oh, I'm back now. Sorry, I've gone and touched something. That's the trouble with these gadgets. No, there weren't. Muriel was the only female ringer until Frances Dodds appeared on the scene. Before that, she was the only one. And in fact, I think I mentioned last time that Bill Froggatt, who used to ring the tenor, didn't like women at all, and thought that they should not be members of his band. And he never spoke to Muriel. He wouldn't have anything to do with her. It was really sad, but there we are. There are people like that, I suppose. Okay, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about conducting and how that's influenced Birmingham ringing over the years. I don't suppose I need to tell you that the value of somebody who can put people right in a band. And if you're training a band, and I guess quite a lot of us have done that, the big problem is that faults occur and the whole thing collapses. Whereas if you've got somebody that can put things right, that let's call that a conductor. If you've got somebody that can put things right, then you can progress, you know, and you can progress quite quickly after that. Well, at my early time of ringing, other than Albert Walker, and Albert, bear in mind, was getting up 80 really, and wasn't exactly sharp. He was sharper than I am now, but I mean, he wasn't a crack conductor anymore, as he had been. And the only conductor really that called everything in Birmingham was George Fern, of course. Now, George did not put people right, or generally did not put people right. So you wouldn't call him a conductor. We called him a bob caller. And so George Fern was the principal conductor. He called nearly a very large number of peals, a very large number of peals. The thing about having a bob caller rather than a conductor is you don't make many mistakes, you know. Otherwise you all go home early, or in our case, to the pub, of course. But that was the situation. So there was George Fern, and who did we have? Who else was there? There was, Skinny P, as Peter Border used to call him, Arthur Pearson. Now, Arthur Pearson, I'm not sure where Arthur came from. I think he might have come from Willenhall. I know he worked in Willenhall. He worked at Chubb's, the locksmiths. And I know that because on occasions when we got locked out of a church, Arthur would say, "Turn your back. Don't look at me." So we'd look away, and he'd say, "Okay, door's open now." he'd actually pick the lock, and it seems that he could pick any lock, and he learnt this at Chubb's, the locksmiths in Wolverhampton. He lived in Claverley, so he was not a resident of Birmingham, but he used to come over quite a lot and call peals. Now, Arthur was a step up from George, definitely. I wouldn't call him a superconductor, but he was he could call spliced. You know, in my day, in my early days, spliced was pretty important. It was fairly new on the scene. We haven't been ringing spliced all over the place, and if you did that, you were quite somebody. On the blacklist, is it now? I can't remember what they call these colours, but you were pretty important if you could ring splice, and Arthur could call splice, and he did, and we rang it, fairly simple splice usually. Then, following Arthur, there was a man that came to live in Coventry, working at Armstrong Whitworth's. Now, he was a Cambridge graduate, and his name was Peter Border. Now, he, of course, became a very good friend of mine, and he and I were great pals and great partners. But when he came to Birmingham, he was a totally different kettle of fish. He not only could compose, he could conduct, he could splice ropes, he could hang bells. There wasn't anything he couldn't do. In fact, Ralph Edwards, who was a member of the band, used to say that this is years after, really, that Peter Border was the most complete ringer. He used to say he could do anything. He could turn up, he could splice the rope, you know, he could do all of these things, and then call the peal from any bell, no matter how heavy it was, and so on. And there's no doubt Peter Border was a pretty important conductor. And around that time, there was Brian Woodruff, who came to the university, and he was quite useful, and he called a lot of peals that I was involved in. I suppose more novice-y type peals, but he did quite a lot of conducting. And then, of course, we had Rod Pipe, who came to university. We're in a different ball game now altogether again, another step up. Rod Pipe was a brilliant conductor, without any shadow of doubt. A lot of people disliked him intensely to start with. Rod knew when you were going to go wrong. She's bloody annoying. Really, and some of the old boys used to get fed up with him because he'd jump on them before they actually went wrong or got a chance to be, you know, to get themselves right. He learned after a while not to do that, and Rod learned a lot about conducting and how to put people right. He began to understand that certain people needed certain things. Nobody could ever get Jack Pinfold right. If Jack Pinfold made a mistake, that was the end of it. Even Rod couldn't sort him out. There's no way you could tell Jack Pinfold anything. Once he'd gone wrong, his brain just scrambled, and that was the end of it. Rod Pipe was learnt what people needed. He spent a lot of time working out what people needed. He knew perfectly well that me, for instance, if I went wrong, he wouldn't know that I was going to go wrong, because I didn't ever change my expression. I just carried on as normal, you know. Whereas in my head, I'm trying to think, where the hell am I? I haven't got a clue. And he would wait until I actually began to make bad blows, and he would then tell me what to do, and I would say, "Shut up, Rod, I know where I am," or I would say, "Thank you very much, sir." It was that sort of thing. So we had those conductors. Then we had after that, of course, we had a couple of good conductors. I'm thinking of Alan Ainsworth, was in Birmingham for quite a while, and he was a good conductor, a very helpful guy. And then, of course, our own Richard Grimmett. Richard, well, I could say a lot about Richard. I will in a minute. I'll get round to it. Right. That was a bit about conductors. I want to skip on a bit now and talk about when I left Birmingham and went to Scotland for a while. In 1973, I'd been doing quite well at work. God knows how, but somehow I kept getting promoted, and they offered me a position in Scotland to run a research project up there that was going to be fairly important, and all that, you know, all that nonsense that they tried to sell. And I didn't know whether I should go or not. I mean, there's a lot to lose from leaving Birmingham. I'm a Brummie, you know, I've always been in Birmingham. Scotland, you know, I quite like to go to Scotland, but not to live. Anyway, I talked with Janice, my wife, and we spent a lot of time talking about it because it was a serious issue. She quite rightly did not want to go. We got two young children at the time. She didn't want to go, and I. It was a big thing for me, you know, in terms of career and my interest and that sort of thing. It was a project that I'd worked on years before, and we'd failed to get success. And here was another opportunity to have a go with a big team and a lot of sponsorship and money and that sort of thing. And I was very keen to, and top management support. I was very keen to go. Anyway, Janice very kindly agreed that I should go. And I spent a year commuting up to Scotland. And the problem was that this project was successful. It was pretty important. It was the most advanced process for making gas from coal, and suddenly a lot of countries were very interested in this. In particular, the Japanese, the Americans, and the Germans, and the site where I worked in Fife became flooded. It would be a term I could use. With visitors who are all nosing around, wanting a bite of this apple, you know. That's what they wanted. And because of this, the board of British Gas, this was, decided that they needed to bring somebody in to manage all of this. And they brought in a general manager who became my immediate boss. We didn't get on, I'm afraid. I'd been working with people who were reasonable all the time. if we needed to do something, or if I disagreed, we could talk about it and so on. As far as he was concerned, his word was law. You will, you won't, you know, and that was it. Get out. And I didn't like this, and so eventually I got back to Solihull. I got a job as head of engineering at Solihull, and that was back into Birmingham. So that was quite a big change. When I got back there, I got interested in ringing again, and I think I mentioned before that Vernon Green, who was the secretary of the Guild at the time, and Tom Warner as the master, was going to retire. And they persuaded me to run for being master of the Guild. I think I told you this last time. I don't want to go over it again. Which I did accept. And the big problem at that time with the Guild was one of communication. It still is, I suppose. It always will be, but it just gets faster and faster, doesn't it? So in those days, if it was all typewritten, you know, there's very little computer work going on in 1973. They were about, but they weren't being used anywhere near as extensively as they are now. So communication was by letter mostly, and that sort of thing. And we were concerned about this. We were, John Illingworth was the secretary of the Guild at that time, and John Illingworth was a great ideas man. Now I'm a doer and a finisher, if you like, and he was a starter and an ideas man. So together we formed quite a decent combination. I get things done, he thinks of it, and I get it done. It was that sort of arrangement. So we tried to sort out the Guild. What we did, one of the things was that the only practice that people could attend that wasn't their own practice was St Martin's. And that was every Tuesday night at St Martin's. But practices, you know, you'd probably get a dozen, maybe up to 20 people there, of a guild of 150 or something like that. It's not really covering the ground. So we decided that we would split the Guild into 3 parts and have a ringing master in each of the parts, to organize practices in their particular area, so that people didn't have to travel so far, and everything was convenient in that direction. We also organized training courses. I think they might have been the first training courses the Guild ran, but I'm not sure. But they were reasonably well attended. And the Tower Captains Conference, I think I mentioned this before, where all the good tower captains turned up and all the ones that we wanted to teach didn't. So that's what you'd expect, par for the course. What else? What else did I do? I became secretary of the Guild. Sorry, I forgot that. And I did that for 9 years. As the minutes will show, all of my minutes were written freehand. It was that's the era I lived in, I'm afraid. Unreadable, of course, but so, and then we had a new office called PR officer, which I did for a short while, I remember, to start it off. And I was also, we got to the point where we needed a representative on the Central Council, and nobody would go for it. The council wasn't felt in high esteem much in those days. So I stood for council and attended the central council. So that was a fair bit about the guild. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, oh yes, at the same time, in 1976 we are now, I went to Knoll. My kids were now, I think, about 10 and 8 or something like that. I went to Knoll a couple of times, and it was clear that Knoll practice was not strong. There were one or two ringers. I remember that one guy in particular, Joe Lightfoot, was the ringing master, I think they called him there, and he. Joe was a very nice guy, but he wasn't a particularly strong ringer or a good teacher or anything like that. So things moved very, very slowly when Joe was there, and so we decided, or Janice decided. She made she had the ideas, and I just did the job, as it were. She decided that we ought to go as a family to Knoll and learn to ring. She had learnt to ring at Birmingham Cathedral in my early days, but I'd been sidetracked ringing too many peals and things like that to teach her properly. So we went as a family and started to ring at Knoll. And there were a few other people that came along as well. And I remember eventually that Stephen and Rose Shipley came to join us. They'd been living away somewhere, but came back to the area. And they were great assets, of course, because they're very capable ringers. And eventually we built a band in Knoll that was quite decent, really. We could certainly ring Splice Surprise and Stedman and things like that on Sunday morning. So we did quite well. During that time, the bells were not going well. The frame was going rotten, actually. The frame was in a pretty bad state at Knoll. And I suppose it was me, concluded that something had to be done about it, and decided that what we wanted was a complete sweep. Get rid of the old bells, the Warner bells, and who were weren't completely out of tune, but weren't tuned very well, and replace the bells and replace the frame with a steel frame and so on. And then, of course, we realized that there was going to be a lot of money involved all of a sudden. Actually, it wasn't a lot of money in today's money, but it was a lot of money then. And how are we going to get this money? So I went to the PCC and I gave a splendid speech with graphs and all that sort of thing, showing how anyway, they paid just like that. you can have it. Yes, go ahead. Good grief. Came away quite stunned. So it was all paid for in no time, in absolutely no time. So we had a new peal of bells. When was that? 1978, was it? Something like that, I think, about that time. And we then rang a lot on those bells. Obviously, we had a band of our own which could ring things. We rang peals with our own band. We rang a long peal of London, I think 14,000 changes of London, which was the longest peal at that time. We rang 20,000 Stedman triples. So we could ring long peals and things like that. So that was quite a useful tower now. Very good, very good. So a lot of good things came out of Knoll. Another item. What? I got a note somewhere. Yeah, I don't want to. I must. I must keep to time. Got to watch this. Teachers spotting me. I've only got 20 minutes. So I'm watching. I'm keeping on to it. Right.
Good job there, John.
Yeah. When I came back from Scotland in 1975, 76, I also went to St Martin's. I went back to St Martin's. I didn't think I would. I hadn't rung for a couple of years, and I didn't think I was going to be able to ring very well. And I just slotted in quite easily, actually. And the band was stronger than when I left it. There's no doubt about that. And that was largely because of Richard Grimmett, who I'd never met before. Richard had come from Handsworth, and he did most of the conducting at St Martin's at that time. Brian Woolley was the actual conductor, and Richard Grimmett did most of the calling because he was able to put it right and things like that. He was a clever kid. So it wasn't long before Richard decided that he was going to leave the area and go to South Africa. And when he did, which was unfortunate. No, I'm skipping along a bit too quick there. What Richard did was transform that band. He brought in lots of youngsters, but mostly lots of younger people, and we actually achieved a Peal of Bristol with our own band. That hadn't been done for 20 odd years, at least, when the Leicester band were the only other band to have done that. So Bristol at that time was seen as something, as quite a milestone. So Richard got us that far. And then he went off to South Africa. And I got the job as conductor from then on, and continued to try and improve the band, and brought in Rob Pipe and David and my daughter Liz. I'm just trying to think who else. Oh, Cliff Barron. There you are. There's four, class ringers that helped enormously. And we went on to ring Orion with our own band. Then that was so that was that's quite a step forward. What else? I must. Oh yeah, refurbishment. I mustn't forget that. I can see after grinning. Yeah, don't forget.
On my list.
Yeah. I'm doing my best to stay on course. One of the problems we had, Charlie Webb nearly always rang the 10th, and it got to the point, and that was largely because the 10th was a difficult bell to ring. It used to move a lot in the tower, the frame moved. And then at some time, Charlie said, I don't want to ring this bell anymore. It's getting too much for me. So I then used to try and get Cliff Barron to ring it, and he would, he clearly reluctant. So it became blooming obvious that something needed to be done about St Martin's bells. So I called an unofficial meeting of the band in St Paul's Tavern, of course, and Muriel attended. One of the few times I've seen Muriel in a pub. Muriel, yeah, we talked about. We had several meetings actually, and we talked about how we could progress this matter and improve the bells at St Martin's. There are all sorts of plans, but eventually we came up with this idea of the world's first ring of 16. How are we going to raise all this money? The world's first ring of 16 bells. So it was not only going to hopefully be a money spinner, that word, but it was also going to give the band something more interesting to do, a new challenge. We just wrung the iron, you know. We were thirsting for new stuff, which Rod was providing, in fairness. Well, I've forgotten where I got to now. Oh yeah, So we decided on what we wanted was a peal of 16 bells. So how do we get this? Well, as it happens, I was on the PCC at that time, and I knew pretty well that the PCC were not going to be falling over themselves to give us money. St. Martin's is a fairly low church that likes to give all its money away abroad to missionaries and things like that, and it wouldn't be too keen on enhancing the bells, you know. I knew that was going to be a problem. Anyway, I put that, needed their approval, of course, put that to them, and they agreed, you know, and the proviso was, as long as it doesn't cost us anything. And that was fine. Okay, so we've got to raise some money. So then we went about how do we progress from there? And it was a question of, well, who's going to do this work? Who's going to cast a peal of 16 bells? Nobody's ever done it before. So the band by this time had formed a little group to manage this project, and that was Alan Burbidge, who would look after the finance and all of the charitable work and things like that we had to keep our eye on, and Rod Pipe would raise the money. He would be fundraising. That was his job. He'd just come back from a job in Bristol where he'd been doing just that. So we said, you're the man for the job. Go and get us, you know, $250,000 or whatever it was we needed. And Richard Jones and I did the work relating to specification and installation. And we had several meetings late at night at both foundries, both at Taylor's and at Whitechapel. And eventually we decided that Whitechapel gave us the best option. And we tendered the job, and Whitechapel won it anyway. So as it happened, that worked out quite well. And we placed the order. Well, no, we didn't. We actually needed to fundraise, and Rod did a lot of the fundraising. And after a year, we got nowhere virtually. So we were really concerned and thought, you know, we can't abandon this now. We've either got to revise the scheme completely and downgrade it, or we've got to go and get the money. And as it happened, there and then, the Birmingham Mail came up with a bell. They offered a bell. We were selling bells basically to particularly to people who had important dates coming up relating to that time, you know, 1990 or whatever it was. And the Birmingham Mail was our godsend, really, because what happened was that they publicised the whole thing and splashed it everywhere, and people began to get interested and join in. And then the developers in the Bull Ring offered the tenor bell, and away it went. And suddenly we got lots and lots of bells being paid for, and lots of money coming in, such that we were able to place an order with Whitechapel, who did the job. Is there anything else to say about that? No, I think it cost best part £250,000. I think that work. So it was a big job. It was certainly the biggest job in the country at that time, and very prestigious, of course, and controversial. I remember Ralph Edwards, who had left and gone to Bristol many years before that, used to chastise Rod. I don't know why he picked on Rod, but he used to pick on Rod and say, "You got that rotten ring of 16 in St Martin's." Whitechapel, you know, that because he was a big Taylor fan and so on. It was controversial. There were lots of people who were against it and for it, and anyway, it happened, and the rest is history, as they say.
And what was it? Can I ask? What was it like to ring on 16 for the first time then?
Terrible.
It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, it was difficult to know what to expect, of course, having not stepped up to that before. But my own personal feeling was, okay, I'm going to find it a little bit of a difficult thing to start with, but I'll soon get the hang of it, and we'll be away. You know, it's no problem. But in reality, I personally found it difficult. There were some people who took to it fairly well, but it was a big step up from 12 to 16. That was a big jump, there's no doubt. And of course, the other problems that you encounter with that sort of step up is that any touches that you want to ring are all long. So whereas we would perhaps ring 4, maybe even 5 touches on a Sunday morning, trying to squeeze things in, we could only ring 2 maybe, or the most 3 with this. So we had to develop new ways of shortening it, shortening the ringing, so that we could get, so that everybody could have a go for a start. Bear in mind that we've now got 25 in the band or something like that, plus all of the visitors that were keen to have a go on 16.
I imagine it attracted quite a lot of interest at the time. It still does, of course.
Yes, that's right. It still does. Well, not at the moment, but
we'll do again soon. A couple of questions have come in, John, if you don't mind.
Okay.
John Rogers has asked how long it took, how long did the whole process take to take out the 12 bells and put the new 16 in?
The whole process from the decision must have been to do something like that would have been 1986.
That's the year I was born.
And did the bells go in 1990 or 91? I can't remember exactly, but roughly about that time. So it's 4 or 5 years to from start to completion. And that wasn't too bad. I mean, there was a time when we were concerned that we wouldn't be able to do it, but at the end of the day, it was well worth doing, I think. The other thing I want to touch on briefly was the 12 bell contest. That was when I came back from Scotland in 1975. One of the first things that was happening was this new contest was being rung at Bristol, at Redcliffe. And I went down to listen to this, and the Birmingham team were competing and didn't do very well. I didn't think much of the ringing at all that day. But then it was agreed that they would start a national contest, and the winners at Redcliffe had been Leicester. So the Leicester band chose to go to St Margaret's, Leicester, and so in 1976 I was involved in that band, and we went to Leicester. 76, yeah, I think it was 76. We went to Leicester St Margaret's, where we rang mixed Cambridge Maximus and Stedman Sinks, and made a complete pig's ear of it, complete mess. We changed from Stedman Sinks into Cambridge Maximus, and I won't tell you what happened, but there were some large gaps, and So we didn't do very well that day. So we were then, well, I and one or two others were very determined that we weren't going to be knocked about and rung as badly as that again. So the next year, unfortunately, we were drawn at Southwark Cathedral, which is a 4,800 weight 12 for those of you that don't know, which was a lot heavier than we were used to messing around with. But nevertheless, we turned up and we had a go and we won. And that was our first win. And from then on, we, as they say, we never looked back. That's not strictly true. We've had one or two hiccups along the way, but in general, and I would say that as far as I know, well, I'm pretty sure, yeah, that every year has got better pretty well. I mean, subject to what the bells are like. I think the bands have improved, and of course the number of bands entering has increased all the time. So that has become a very important contest now, with lots and lots of visitors. So you get several hundred people at that event, and certainly the other thing that we did in those days was to ring the Worthington Shield, which was a 10-bell contest at Burton-on-Trent, and also the Tewkesbury Shield, which was a 10-bell contest at Tewkesbury. And there was one year, I do recall, when we had held all three trophies, the 12-bell, the Worthington, and the Tewkesbury Shield, which was quite something. So Birmingham ringing has been quite at the fore. Chris is holding up a picture of the three bands. Yeah, the three with the trophies. Yeah, I remember that. Can anybody see that? Can everybody see it? Maybe they can't. I don't know. I can see it, but and I know what it is, of course.
That was one of my ambitions as ringing master, John, but I failed in that endeavour.
What to win all
contests.
Yeah. What else? Yeah. Oh dear, I'm nearly there. Yeah. I must say something about the Central Council.
Yeah.
Simon, if you're listening or watching this, you can. I'll give you a wire when I'm about to tell you the nasty bits, and you can turn off because you may not want to hear that. I was on the Central Council for quite a few years, actually, and during that time I was vice president and president, and the way you got there in those days, it wasn't quite like Simon was plucked out of his brilliance and dropped into the top job. You had to earn your keep, as it were, in those days. So I worked quite hard and was head of the PR group, I think they called it in those days. And one of the people on the PR committee was David Thorne. Now, David Thorne had been editor of the Ringing Wheel for a good many years, and he was a very good friend of mine. He was super. And I remember we were in Malvern. We'd finished ringing in Malvern after a meeting, and he said, do you know, you ought to run for president. Don't be silly, David, go away. And anyway, he had 2 or 3 goes at me, and then two pretty important people, Wilfrid Morton, who was a well-known national figure, really. Wilfrid Morton had been a prominent person on the council, and Bob Cools was also a pretty well-known person. Said, we'd like to propose you as president, as vice president. So what can you say? You know, yes, okay, I'll do it. So I was vice president, and one of the big problems I thought with the Central Council at that time was, again, communications. Same old problem. but you know, it was bloody Victorian. I mean, it's a lot better now than it was. It's still not 100%, I'm sure, but it wasn't. It wasn't good. It had 230 members. It still has got that number, I think, and that's a lot of people. You want to try chairing a meeting with 230 people, all of whom want to speak. And you've got to. It's quite difficult to control. And then arguments burst out. Some, particularly if they're technical, which used to drive me nuts because I wasn't particularly technical. But they get down to arguing about the reticulation of a gnat's kneecap, and I was obliged to carry on listening and try and stay up with it. But there we are. That was one of the good things. I was also, during my presidency, we had the Millennium, and we had two major projects at that time. One was to recruit ringers, which we did, and we recruited something like 5,000, I think, ringers altogether to ring Millennium bells. And the other one was money for bell restoration. And we raised numbers, 5 million. I think we got £5 million from the Millennium Commission, and we spent a lot of time distributing this money to the various needy causes around the country, and lots of bells have come into fruition as a result of that sort of work. And I was involved quite a bit with the Open Churches Trust at that time, which is one of Andrew Lloyd Webber's babies, and he, well, actually his father-in-law ran it, but we spent several lunches with them, and no, I won't tell you about Andrew Lloyd Webber early in the morning, but I think I'll refrain from that. He would undoubtedly sue me. So I think my time is up, sir. Thank you very much.
John, thank you ever so much. I had one actual quick question. So I know you know time is almost up, but John, I just wondered what do you think has kept Birmingham at the forefront of ringing for so long, you know, for so many decades? That's a big question.
Yeah, it is really, because I mean, you've got to go back a very long way. You've got sort of certainly the second half of the 19th century, when Birmingham had a developing 12-bell band, and before that, of course, there were the Stedman Triples boys, Lates, and all of those. So Birmingham ringing had been on the map for a very long time. This isn't something that suddenly sprung up. You know, it's been there for quite a long time. Birmingham has been at the fore. It's just that people know much more about these things these days than they did in those days. Then the war was a big setback. The Second World War certainly cost Birmingham ringing quite a bit, certainly at St Martin's. So it dipped at that point, but we brought it back, and like I said, you got people who are decent conductors. It's amazing what you can do, and of course, good ringing attracts good ringers. That's another thing. When I look around the band at St Martin's now, and ask myself, how many of these are actually Brummies? And the answer is not many. They're all imports, and but that's the way life is these days. People do move around a lot more. Perhaps another thing that I used to think was helpful in Birmingham was the fact that we were a compact guild geographically, and we didn't have the problems of the Oxford Guild and the Yorkshire Association, where you know you've got You've got to go 100 miles to a practice and things like that. We could get on a bus, or in my time a tram, into Birmingham and do e-ringing. So that helped. A whole variety of things. Now, of course, I look around and I see on a Sunday morning, well, I used to anyway, look around and I see the best band in the country without any shadow of doubt. Some really skilled ringers, absolutely marvellous. And it occasionally gets some good ringing. And I'm still very critical, of course.
Thank you, John. It's really interesting, the parallels to St Martin's, Birmingham and ringing after the war, because of course, in some ways, there could arguably be a bit of a parallel at the moment, when we go back to ringing next year, properly. But hopefully this also gives us optimism and hope, that actually things will build back up, in time.
I'm sure you're right. They'll spring back, undoubtedly.
John, thank you so much for coming back a second time. I know you were a little bit worried about, would you have enough to fill? But I think, you kept us enraptured for 2 hours, which is, an incredible feat. And I think people at the end of your last talk, I had so many messages, and I hope you did as well, of just thanks, and people were just fascinated to hear it. So, thank you for all the time that you put into this. I've had a couple of private messages of people who had to leave a little bit early. So Phil Ramsbottom and Steve Askew have said thank you very much. And I'm sure, on behalf of the people here tonight, thank you for your time again.
Well, thank you. I've surprisingly rather enjoyed it, but
yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry I got